In a COVID world, schools are closed and it has become difficult for many parents to dedicate and commit the time that is necessary for their child's learning, especially at the secondary school level. Victoria Literacy Centre's homeschooling online program is designed for you. Your child will receive individual attention from trained professionals. With specially tailored online programs, it offers academic support to all students in forms 1 to 5, whether they are mainstream or challenged. I admire VLC because it is a home away from home in a virtual space and caters to the specific needs of your child. I am Pamela and my children will definitely be a part of Victoria Literacy Centre's homeschooling online starting September 2020.
Welcome to the Caribbean Parenting Digital Show. This talk show is presented each week by host Alina Lewis and features guests from our Caribbean islands right here on this channel. As we discuss family finances, proverbial principles, child guidance, and academics at home, guests join in weekly to have conversations that give helpful tips about how to be a better parent. Like, subscribe, follow, and share as you tune in each week for new episodes of the Caribbean Parenting Digital Show. Hi, good evening, and welcome to the Caribbean Parenting Digital Show. Through this platform, we have conversations that give helpful tips about how to be a better parent each day. And today we're pleased to have Trishana Sirju-Arjoon returning to the studio with us to discuss family finances, giving focus on emergency savings. Now, we know that most of us, we would have a certain set of fixed expenses each month. And these bills have to be paid on time if we want to build and maintain an excellent credit rating. But let's say as a person, you're living week to week or month to month, or you find yourself having no savings at all or a minimal amount at the bank. If you or a person in that position suffers a job loss, a cut in working hours, it could be quite a difficult situation. And that is why no matter how hard it is, setting up and maintaining an emergency fund must be placed as some level of priority in order to ensure that whether you're a single person or you're a parent within a family structure, you're going to be able to make it through tough economic times. Now, today's discussion is meant, as always, to help us to understand the possibilities that exist within the range of family and finances, so that no matter what the situation, we'd be able to cope effectively. So joining us now is Trishana Sirju-Arjoon. Trishana, thank you and welcome once again to the Caribbean Parenting Digital Show.
Hi, Alina.
Yeah, so even as we jump right on in, let's take a look at emergency savings.
Right.
What is an emergency saving? Can you share a bit more on that?
Sure. I think it's an important question for us to explore because oftentimes we will have savings that we say will be dedicated towards emergencies, and then everything becomes an emergency. So we want to make sure that we kind of define when we're going to touch the emergency savings. And generally, emergency savings should be used for situations where property or life is at stake. So, the hurricane season is going on and we get a warning that, a hurricane is heading in our direction, or we're expecting flash flooding and we need to put things in place to protect our property or our loved ones. That's an emergency. That's a real emergency. The car is broken down so that we can't have access to going to take our kids to school or wherever, or goes for groceries. That's a level of an emergency as well. Medical emergencies, of course, our children being sick, or we having an emergency where we're not feeling well and we need to see a specialist or have a surgery done. All those things constitute emergencies. What does not constitute an emergency is things that we should be on our regular budget. So groceries or the rent or the mortgage, we shouldn't be dipping into our emergency funds for those things, because those things should have already been budgeted for in our regular budget. I mean, I say this understanding that we are living in a pandemic, and oftentimes our regular budget is being thrown out the door because our income is, for a lot of us, our income has been affected severely. And emergency funds, therefore, will also step in a case where you have loss of income. Because ideally, emergency funds, Alina, should range from somewhere between 6 months of your normal income to about a year of your normal income, depending on, how much your regular monthly income is. So, for example, a family that has an income of $10,000 per month should aim for at least having a $60,000 fund, or better, you'd be in a better situation if you have that 120,000, because what that will allow for is a family to deal with the real emergency of a breadwinner losing their job, especially during the times that we live in, to cope with the day-to-day normal expenses. So in that case, our normal expenses will be coming out of the emergency fund, because the emergency is loss of job, loss of income.
Right. And so, even as we continue with our discussion, we want to look at, why is having an emergency saving important? And of course, we're looking at it from the perspective that we all know as adults we should have an emergency saving. We all know, oh, yes, it's important, but yet for so many of us, it's not prioritized. So, for those persons who don't have an emergency saving, have had what they believe to be all the reasons in the world why they couldn't set up an emergency saving, or it hasn't been maintained, what should persons in that experience understand about the importance of having or building or maintaining the emergency saving fund?
I think across the country, we saw around, I think, mid-April, why we should all have an emergency fund. We had so many families in desperate need from just having a few weeks loss of income. I think that was really an eye-opener for all of us to understand the real value of having an emergency funds. None of us expected that in 2020 we were going to have to start dipping into emergency funds. Nobody started off the year thinking that. Perhaps you were thinking this is the year you're going to build it, but having it there for those people who did, I'm sure they're still using from it. But for those people who were prepared, the pandemic and the situation that we're going through right now would have been a little bit easier. So emergency fund is really important, because situations like this unfortunately happens, and we need to be prepared for it. And in any normal situation, the loss of income, loss of a job happens, because companies are all the time retrenching, moving around job descriptions and restructuring, and so there's always a chance of you becoming unemployed temporarily. So that's one of the main reasons why you want to have an emergency fund. The other reason is, oftentimes, if you are planning well and you're saving for long-term goals, so let's say you're saving towards a car or a down payment on your home, or for children's university fees. If it is you don't have an emergency fund to deal with situations like medical emergencies or loss of income, what will happen is you go and you dip into those funds when emergencies do happen. So you have a medical emergency, you go and you take out of the children's university fund, or you have an emergency with preparing for a storm, and you go and you take out of the mortgage fund. And so what it does is it pushes back your goals and making you have to push it back those deadlines. So your aim might have been 2025 to down pay on the house, but now it's pushed back to 2027 because you touched the funds a few times. So that's the two aspects I think really important. Emergency funds protect your long-term goals, because it prevents you from having to dip into those savings accounts. And what it also does is it prepares you for situations like we're living through, where unfortunately loss of income is real, as well as medical emergencies. So, Alina, I think those two are the two main categories we want to pay attention to when we're really thinking about how important it is that we start building an emergency fund now.
Yes, definitely. Even as you were chatting, Trishana, one of the things I wanted to ask you, when
Mhm.
it comes to the emergency savings, I can imagine someone who maybe has not been prepared, did not quite get to the point of making it a priority,
Mhm.
is asking where to start. So even when we think of you as a financial advisor, maybe based on products and solutions you offer or that other types of institutions offer, what can you share with us so that we can understand what are the structures that are available, the types of institutes that we should turn to, the types of funds, accounts, where to start? Could you
Right.
take a minute and share about what is available to us locally? So whether we have a small budget or a larger budget, we could start somewhere.
So, I also put in some thoughts into this, Alina. I thought of building your financial portfolio holistically, and I think emergency funds need to form part of your of that portfolio. So, when you're thinking about how to get organized, I thought it would be really it would be I would miss a whole segment of it if I didn't mention that we need to have insurance as part of it. What is the biggest emergency a family can go through? Is the loss of a loved one, the loss of a breadwinner. So if that is that emergency brings up so many issues. You're gonna have funeral expenses immediately, perhaps medical bills that were left behind. Um, Understanding how to move forward now with a loss of income, perhaps if it's the main breadwinner, loss of a significant part of the family's income. So the death of a loved one brings up a real emergency. And so in planning for emergencies, we need to also incorporate life insurance for those breadwinners in the home. Critical illness insurance, medical emergencies drain our savings if we don't plan for them. And so those two components, and we make sure we have some savings on them, or we have a separate savings account that is dedicated to have an emergency towards our emergency fund. So those three together, savings, life insurance for the breadwinners, as well as critical illness coverage, will ensure that no matter what happens to our family, we are prepared and we can dip into the relevant funds when the time comes. So again, those three things: life, critical illness, and savings. How to get started, in times when we are already pinched for cash, is start small. It's better to start small now than to say I'll start big next year. So start small and increase it as time goes by. If it's difficult for you to set aside savings, then set a standing order from your salary or from your bank account to somewhere else, so that it's not something you need to physically do, and it's not something that you need to think about. And so a small amount moves out of your account every month into building something that will protect your family in the long term. I think having a structure where you definitely say X amount goes into an account every month is a really nice way to get started, because it makes sure, Alina, that you do something every month rather than you say, well, this month I'll skip, but next month I'll put extra. So the standing order helps you to get regular so that you don't have to think about it and there's no maybe next month kind of thing happening.
So is it fair to then to say first thing first, if you don't have a bank account, you need to go to the bank. Don't
Yeah,
physically
I
go
know we
at home
hear
right
I
now,
I
but we need to get to the bank.
but I know a lot of people say, we have this distrust for banks, and understandably so. So go to a credit union, whoever you trust.
Good. So
So
let me
if
rephrase it. I'm
yes,
kind of glad you said that. So
yeah,
not specifically go to a bank, but
yes,
choose a financial institution.
that's
So
right.
whether that financial institution is a commercial bank
Yes,
or whether it is a credit union of sort or
yes.
some whatever option you
Yes.
have.
So I know, I mean, I work at Guardian Life, but Guardian Life is not a bank. So I wouldn't say bank all of your
Yes.
everyday cash at Guardian Life. What you need an account where you seek every day, and you purchase things, and yes, that kind of thing.
Right.
So a
So
credit union or a bank, yeah.
yeah, so from a very practical perspective, if you don't have an account with any sort of financial institution, step one is to pursue that. Pick up
Yes,
the
take it
phone,
out
make
of
a
the
call.
mild pan and head it to the
Don't
bank.
try to walk in. We're in the middle of a pandemic. Do not try to walk and go and say, "Hey, I come." Take up the phone and call. Um, check online to see maybe who has a toll-free number. A lot of institutions have toll-free numbers or mobile numbers that allow you to connect
That's
with
right.
them. Their social media, you can reach out to them using their social media pages, whatever.
Yes.
Connect, get the information online, gather your details, ask as many questions as you need. So step number one probably is, if you don't have an account, get one.
That's right.
Based on what you're saying, is it accurate, Trishana, to say step number two is to make technology your friend? Because what I'm hearing you say is standing orders, online banking, fill the form, whatever
So
it
I mean,
is.
it's online banking with COVID-19 happening is key, But if you're really not into the online banking, setting up a standing order through your bank again to wherever you put in your savings,
Yes,
then you could do that
and
physically with a
that
yeah.
too is making technology a friend, because it takes technology to sign your form, and then the
Right.
technology causes the money to move from your account to
That's
where you
right.
need it to go.
Yes.
So technology is a good friend, not just
Yes.
for surfing online, but for helping make it easy to set that up. And so whether it's $10,000, $1,000, $100, it does not matter. Whether it's $50, whether it's $10. I think what I hear you say as well, Trishana, is start somewhere. Whatever
Yes.
is your
That is
starting
important.
point,
Yes.
start somewhere, and automating that process makes it easy.
Yes.
Yes. And once we
Yes.
start talking about automating the process, we're talking about standing orders, where you fill a form at your bank, giving them authorization to have a certain amount of money be transferred from your account to maybe another bank or another institution or another account each month on a certain day, to make sure that saving is building up. I think chatting, Trishana, as well with your HR department maybe could be helpful.
Yes, of course. If you work for an institution, usually bigger companies will facilitate this. But if you work for, let's say, the public sector or a bigger company where HR is willing to facilitate a transfer every month directly from you to, let's say, the account is at Garden, to Garden Life to pay for your insurance and your savings, etc. That's the easiest one. And actually, it's the most reliable form, because HR, once it's set up, HR is very consistent in how they send across your funds. And so that's often the most reliable source of payment towards your insurance premiums that we have found.
Yeah, and just encourage persons to consider. Talk with your banking people, ask questions, find out, listen, this is what I want to do. What service do you have that will allow me to do this? Ask questions, find out what the options are. If you never ask, you're not going to know. So
Yes.
that way, it makes it easy for you to make an informed decision to get started. Because, Trishana, I think chances are getting started is the most difficult part
Yes. And
sometimes for a
oftentimes
lot of persons.
people often think that it requires a lot of investment too, because oftentimes I'll meet people who are, let's say, in their 30s or 40s, and they've not yet done life insurance, and I'll say, well, how come you didn't get around to it yet? And often they'll say, well, I could have never afforded it. But sometimes it will just cost you $100 or $200 per month to get started. And so they say, wow, if I had known that, I would have started 10 years ago. So
Right.
it's important to talk to your financial advisor, because
Have
sometimes you don't know.
conversations.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so even before we move on to continuing to chat about this, what is your number, Trishana?
It's 326-5412.
Very good.
Yes.
So
If you
persons
don't
who are
want to,
thinking, sorry, go
yeah.
ahead.
If you don't want to have a long conversation, send me a WhatsApp, and I answer your questions. Yeah.
Yeah. So, we're encouraging you, even if you're sitting looking at this right now and thinking, I don't know who to talk to, I don't know anybody, I don't understand what the people at the bank saying, call Trishana. message,
Yeah.
WhatsApp her, because I'll give you an example. I was chatting with someone recently who does not have a bank account. And I keep saying, why don't you have? And the response is, I called and I asked, but they were telling me some kind of thing that I didn't understand. This is what I'm being told, yeah?
Yeah.
I didn't understand. And so I picked up the phone and I made a call and said, hey, this is what is happening with the person. What documents do they need? And so I tell that little excerpt there to say, I do understand sometimes if you're not into technology and banking and finance and all these things, it could be overwhelming for some persons
I
thinking
agree.
about stepping into it, but it is for your benefit. So this is
That's
why,
right.
we're having this conversation to encourage you in very practical ways
Yes.
that you can move forward to be able to have the benefits of saving, building, and knowing what your options are.
That's
Yeah.
right.
So, Trishana, even as we continue on with the conversation, one of the things I want to be able to ask is pertaining to strategies for building emergency savings during times of crisis, because we're in a pandemic. Within Trinidad and Tobago, at least, many persons have been unemployed, underemployed, temporarily unemployed, and everything in
Mm-hmm.
between since March of 2020. There are some persons who have not worked since then. There are people who
Yeah.
fall in that category that have not been able to go back to work.
Yeah.
So the pandemic in itself is like an experience of crisis when it pertains to finances and so
Definitely.
on. But I also want to give view to the people who outside of the pandemic experience crisis for whatever reason, and because they experience crisis, and I'll even throw in the word limitation, that they may find it very difficult to set up emergency savings. What are some of the strategies or any other tips you could provide to help persons understand that, listen, even in the midst of a crisis, this is what you should understand, this is what you should do?
Yeah. If we're in the middle of a crisis and our families are finding it difficult to meet our bills while we're in the middle of a crisis, be it, the current pandemic or otherwise, then imagine how much more difficult it is going to be for your family if, God forbid, you had died yesterday or you get a diagnosis for a heart attack or cancer. Then today they would have been having to find the money to do those things as well as having to find the money to save. So my suggestion is figure out what you're even during this time. I know if it's you're unemployed, it's going to be very difficult for you to make that decision now. But gathering the information. So for people who really and truly it's impossible for you to find any funds right now, gather the information. There's no financial advisor, including myself, who will tell you I don't want to give you information because you can't start right now. I'm always willing to have a conversation months in advance. Sometimes I talk to people and years later then we actually get going. Get the information so that you're empowered to know what to do when you can't afford it. And for those of you who can, $100 or $200, I mean, it sounds for some of us during this time it's going to be difficult to even come up with that. But for those of you who can, take that step and find out what you can do with it, because it might mean with $200 you can get some life insurance and also start your emergency savings, so, or a critical illness and start emergency savings. So talk to your advisor, send me a message and say, hey, what's it going to cost me? This is my date of birth, and let's have a conversation. Let's start the conversation, so that you can figure out just what you can do with the little that you have right now. And what we also do is we plan for the future. So we say, okay, $200 is all I can afford right now, Trishana, but let's see how the pandemic pans out to the end of the year and let's review this when my income is more steady. So Alina, I think during crisis, planning is important because we want to empower ourselves with information. And secondly, if you can start with even a small amount, take that step. I think sometimes we need crisis to urge us on. Oftentimes people will wait until family members are ill and then they'll call and say, listen, my sister has X, I need to get myself some, coverage now. So sometimes crisis is good in that it pushes us forward to make these decisions. It urges us to see the emergency in the situation. So that's my take on right now building and starting for emergency fund building, Alina.
And even as we consider, Trishana, that many persons looking at us are adults, but also parents, and we know that as parents, we want to do our best to set an example for our kids. How can adults help children to build emergency savings,
So
in their own little way?
so I thought about this and I thought, so it depends on the age, right? So if I mention emergency to my 4-year-old, because I've told her emergency is kind of, um, it's I feel like it brings off alarm bells in her head because we've explained that if it's an emergency, you need to deal with it quickly and you need to take care of it and wait and that kind of thing. So for kids at that small age, maybe we don't frame it as an emergency fund, but definitely for teenagers and older children, we say, okay, we want to build an emergency funds because life happens and we need to be prepared for it. But more importantly, I think we spoke about this in one of the previous sessions, but encouraging children to just save um, helps to prepare them for the long term, for adulthood. I think a nice strategy, Alina, could be that we allow them to save part, or we encourage them to save part of their um, allowance that they receive monthly or weekly. And at the end, so let them set a goal. Let them set some goals, some long term goals, and also show them that, if you keep dipping into that fund, so let's say their long term goal is to buy a new phone. So after a year, they work out how much it's gonna take for them to reach to that goal, and and show them that if you keep dipping into that and you keep taking out of it to buy snacks or whatever, then it's gonna take longer for you to get to that goal. And I think that brings around the whole idea that we need to have these funds set aside for important things, in this case, their phone. But also, we need to make sure that we don't touch it until we get to that important milestone. So, again, it will depend on the age of the child. So, as you get older, teenagers, of course, you can share more information with them and make it real so that they understand that when life happens, when things like COVID and the pandemic is happening, that we need to be prepared as a family for long-term things happening. But of course, the younger ones, just encourage them to save and help them to get rewards out of the savings too. So, every couple of weeks, let them buy something small so that they understand that savings has its reward because you're planning for the future, you're planning for goals, things you want to achieve.
Yeah, definitely. And of course, this time we want to get into our participant Q&A. But even before we start taking those questions, we want to recognize that the production of this episode rather, is sponsored by Victoria Literacy Center. And they are providing, even in the midst of, dealing in this COVID recovery state that we're in, where schools are closed, they're providing online schooling for students. So we just want to take a minute as we take a word from them as our sponsor from Victoria Literacy Center.
In a COVID world, schools are closed and it has become difficult for many parents to dedicate and commit the time that is necessary for their child's learning, especially at the secondary school level. Victoria Literacy Center's homeschooling online program is designed for you. Your child will receive individual attention from trained professionals. With specially tailored online programs, it offers academic support to all students in forms 1 to 5, whether they are mainstream or challenged. I admire VLC because it is a home away from home in a virtual space and caters to the specific needs of your child. I am Pamela and my children will definitely be a part of Victoria Literacy Center's homeschooling online starting September 2020.
Now, the first question that we have asked, as we face economic challenges during this time, how can I effectively create an emergency savings? So Trishana, is it that this question pulls from our discussion about institutions that they can go to?
Yeah. So I mean, okay, so of course you're gonna have to start with how much you can afford. So going back to, our discussion in the previous weeks, you need to sit down and work your budget. First and foremost, to figure out what is affordable for you right now in the situation. Um, and if it is, depending on the amount, of course, you know what methods you can use. So if it's that you can only start with $40, then we need to have a discussion about where $40 is going to be effective. If you can start with $500, then of course we can have a conversation about where it's going to be more effective. So you want to invest it in a place where it's going to be available for you on short notice, because of course if it's an emergency, you want to have access to it quickly. And also so for example, you don't want to put it into a fixed deposit where you're going to have to pay fees and be penalized if it needs to be broken. So you want to start with the budget, and of course, once you figure that out, figure out what tools it will be most effective for whatever that budget is. And again, you need to have a conversation in order for that to
And
happen.
remind our audience, Shoshana, when you talk about tools that are most appropriate, what are we referring to?
I'm talking about either you're using it. So, for example, if you have $40 that you can only set aside for the emergency savings, right? But you might say, okay, I also want to do my life insurance, and all I can put aside for that is $100. So in total, my budget is $140. We're in crisis, but I want to get this done. Then you can do the $40 savings on a life insurance policy. Yeah, they're two different components of a same policy. The funds are available to you, at quick notice. You can get a check within the same day, but it gets you started, right? Versus if you have, let's say, $800 that you can set aside for emergencies, then of course you can use an investor account where the returns are higher. The funds are still very available to you, but that you will build quickly, because of course you're investing more. Yeah.
Understood. And we have a second question here that asks, with the reopening of school transitioning to online learning, how can a parent cater for the use of technology in terms of the internet and laptop, etc.? And I'm guessing this now is from the perspective of the parent who may not have had these resources but find themselves needing it at this time.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, there are many families across Trinidad who's looking at this question and hoping that we have an answer, because they're going to have to figure out something before next week. Unfortunately, apart from finding it within your budget, maybe there are some, and honestly, I can't provide any help with regard to this other than the resources that I've seen out there. And so I've seen that there are companies who are offering to fix. There are IT people who are offering to fix all devices. And so maybe you reach out to these people and see if maybe you have laptops that you're willing to donate to me and my family, because we are in need. And also on the flip side, if you have all laptops and you want to donate to these, you could, I don't know the names of them, but maybe I could share this with you after, Alina, and we could share
Sure.
this with our viewers, because there were quite a few IT persons I saw put out posts last week from different areas in Trinidad, and they were asking for old laptops from people. And I'm sure people who've been using laptops for many years have an old one or two lying around. The battery stopped working, the screen stopped working, whatever. And we could donate these and help a family, because really and truly it means that a family is going to have to find $3,000 or $4,000 to find a laptop in the next week. And for some people, that's really not a reality. So I think we need to kind of, as a community, come together and assist those people. And apart from that, I think the ministry has, put some interim measures in place, preparing work via print media and so on for those persons. But as much as we can, we should assist. And yeah.
Yes, and last but certainly not least, I think this question lends itself to something we spoke about earlier, which is COVID-19 itself being an emergency that no one prepared for.
Mhm.
Can I begin an emergency fund now, and how? Could you just remind the viewing audience who may have tuned in late of the details that would support answering this question?
Right. Um, so I'm just gonna go back to the previous
Yes.
question where we talked about go back to your budget because we need to figure out how much, right? How much you can set aside towards building an emergency fund. And even though we're in the middle of an emergency, it does not mean that we can't start building for the future. There's no time like now. And even though, as I said earlier, even though it may not be that you're starting with a lot, it's better to start now with a small amount than to wait next year and say you're going to start with a big amount. Start small now and you can always increase it later on. But I think key takeaways are one, get started.
Yes.
Two, send me a message and ask me what tools can I use, what tools do I have available to me, what type of plans do I have available to me for this amount. And let's talk about it that way. And then be consistent. So be prepared to make sure that you have a bank account or credit union account, something in place that you can be consistent towards your payments, towards your emergency fund, because that's the only way it's going to accumulate over time. I also want to just mention, Alina, because I keep talking about having your life insurance and your critical illness insurance in place, because I think it forms a key part of preparing for emergencies. And because other than if we prepare for those two things, it means that we're going to have to dip into our emergency fund more often when those things happen. So those three things, your critical illness and coverage, your life insurance, your emergency fund, those three things together, what they do is they form an umbrella over the rest of your savings, over the rest of your goals. And it prevents you from having to touch your long-term savings for those long-term goals every time something happens.
Yeah. Okay, great. So Trishana, that's all for our Q&A
Mhm.
time. So even as we close on this episode, what final thoughts would you like to share with our viewing audience?
I would say, going back to our very first episode, it's really important to start with your budget because I think oftentimes we have funds in there that can be allocated to better use. And sometimes it might mean that we're just moving around funds. So it might mean that we're taking $200 from where we spend on something else and we allocate it, strategically to an emergency fund. In the long term, it's going to be very beneficial to your family. I think we all saw it in April this year when families, after only 1 month loss of income, really and truly were in desperate times. So again, start with your budget and send me a message and let's figure out how we can get started. My number again, Alina, is 326-5412. That's it.
Yeah, great, Trishana. Thank you so much for joining us once again.
No problem. Always a
For yet
pleasure.
another episode. It's always great having you come in to chat with us about finances and the family. And to our viewing audience, we thank you as well for joining in for yet another episode of the Caribbean Parenting Digital Show. Now, as a bi-weekly show, it's streamed digitally each Wednesday and Sunday right here on this channel. So I want to encourage you to just take that quick second, like the video. Be sure to like and subscribe to our channel and share, tag friends, because this is such an important conversation that really could make a difference in someone's life a year, 3 years, 5 years from now, even as we share information about family and finances and building emergency saving. We appreciate that you've tuned in for this episode of the Caribbean Parenting Digital Show and trust that you are now better equipped as a parent to support your children and by extension your family unit based on the information shared. So I am Alina Lewis, and until next time, take care.